Hajun was a man who controlled entire neighborhoods with a single phone call. But when his maid hummed that melody, his body reacted before his mind could stop it. Hajun did not believe in accidents. In his world, everything had a cause, every betrayal, every disappearance, every silence. He had built his empire on that belief that control was order and emotion was liability. That was why the garden existed. Perfect hedges, measured stone paths, roses trimmed with surgical precision. Nothing was allowed to grow wild inside Hajun's estate. Not plants, not people, not memories. Then the humming began. It drifted through the hedges, light and careless, carried by the morning air. Not loud, not intentional, just a woman working, unaware that each note was peeling back something Hajun had buried alive. Tamara Huber stood near the roses, hose in hand, red apron damp at the edges. Her eyes were closed. She didn't see him behind her. She didn't see his men freeze. She didn't see the color drain from Hajun's face. But he heard everything. He heard the pauses, the rise in the third note, the exact place where the melody always hesitated, like it was waiting to be forgiven. His wife used to hum that song when she thought no one was listening. Hajun's chest tightened, because no one living was supposed to know it. And yet, this woman did. Hajun didn't build an empire by feeling things. He built it by erasing them. His estate stretched across 12 acres of manicured perfection, wrapped in iron gates and watched by men who understood that loyalty wasn't a choice. It was survival. Cameras blinked from every corner. Guards rotated in shifts so precise you could set your watch by the crunch of gravel under their boots. This wasn't a home. It was a fortress designed to keep the world out and one man's emotions buried 6 feet under. They called him the Ice King in certain circles. Not because he was cruel, though he could be, but because nothing moved him. Not threats, not bribes, not the pleading eyes of men who knew they were about to disappear. Hajun had perfected the art of emotional amputation. He'd learned early that sentiment was a liability, a crack in the armor that enemies could exploit. So he became the man who didn't crack, the man who didn't flinch, the man who signed death warrants with the same indifference most people reserved for grocery lists. But there was one wound he never let anyone see. 3 years ago, his wife died. Yuna. Her name existed only in the silence between his heartbeats now. A word he refused to speak aloud because speaking it meant admitting she was gone. There were no photos on the walls, no reminders in drawers, no soft corners in this house where her memory could hide and ambush him when he wasn't prepared. He'd stripped the estate clean of her, boxed everything up, and locked it away in a room no one was allowed to enter. Even the staff knew better than to mention her. It wasn't a rule he'd written down. It was a rule they felt in the air, heavy and absolute, like the moment before lightning strikes. And music. God, the music. Hajun had banned it entirely. No radios, no phones playing songs in the kitchen, no humming, no whistling, no melodies drifting through open windows. Because Yuna had loved music. She'd hummed while she cooked, sang while she folded laundry, filled every corner of this cold house with warmth he didn't know how to replicate. So he deleted it. All of it. If he couldn't have her voice, no one else's would do. He told himself this was strength. That grief was for weaker men who let their emotions make them sloppy. Hajun believed he'd buried love the same day he buried her. That by refusing to mourn he'd somehow beaten death at its own game. He was wrong, of course. You don't bury love. You bury the permission to feel it. And in that garden, with a melody he thought he'd killed, Hajun was about to learn that some things refuse to stay dead. If you've ever tried to outrun grief, you know it doesn't work. But maybe you're curious what happens when a man like Hajun finally stops running. Hit that like button if you want to see where this story goes, because what happens next will shatter everything he thought he controlled. Tamara Huber had been working at the estate for 3 weeks, and in that time she'd perfected the art of disappearing while standing in plain sight. Eyes down, hands busy, mouth closed unless someone asked her a direct question. And even then, her answers came out quiet and careful, like she was defusing a bomb with every word. She'd learned young that survival meant making yourself small, so small that people forgot you were even there. It was a skill you picked up in foster homes where being noticed meant being moved, or worse, being remembered for the wrong reasons. Her childhood was a jigsaw puzzle with half the pieces missing. She remembered fragments. A yellow kitchen with peeling linoleum, the smell of burnt toast, a woman's voice saying her name in a language that wasn't English. But the connections between those fragments didn't exist. Social workers had moved her between homes so many times the faces blurred together, and somewhere along the way, Tamara stopped trying to remember. It hurt less that way. The case file said she'd arrived in the country at 7 years old, that her mother had disappeared, that she'd spent the next decade being passed around like paperwork no one wanted to file. By 18, she'd aged out of the system with nothing but a high school diploma and a bone-deep understanding that no one was coming to save her. So she saved herself. She took jobs that didn't ask questions, cleaned houses for people who preferred staff that didn't make eye contact, learned to read a room before she entered it, to sense when someone's mood was about to turn dangerous. The estate job had seemed like a blessing at first. Good pay, private quarters, a garden so beautiful it didn't feel real. She didn't ask why the previous maid had left so suddenly. She didn't ask why the house felt like a mausoleum despite all the sunlight. She just showed up every morning at 6, kept her head down, and did the work. The humming started without her permission. It always did. Her hands would be wrist-deep in soapy water or wrapped around the handle of a watering can, and the melody would just slip out, soft and low, like her body remembered something her mind had locked away. She didn't know where she'd learned it, didn't know if someone had sung it to her once or if she'd made it up during one of those long, silent nights in a twin bed that never felt like hers. All she knew was that the sound made her chest feel less tight, made the world feel less sharp around the edges. It was the only thing she had that belonged to her. She had no idea it was a grenade with the pin already pulled. No idea that the man who employed her had spent 3 years making sure that exact melody never reached his ears again. And maybe that's the cruelest part of this story. The way danger finds you even when you're trying your hardest to stay invisible. If you've ever felt like the past was chasing you even though you couldn't remember what you were running from, stay with me. Because Tamara's about to discover that some debts get paid whether you remember borrowing or not. Drop a comment if you're already worried about her, because you should be. Hajun raised his hand. The guards stopped mid-step like someone had hit pause on their existence. The gravel didn't crunch. The birds went quiet. Even the morning breeze seemed to hold its breath. He stood there on the stone path, head tilted slightly, listening with the concentration of a man trying to disarm something volatile. The melody drifted through the roses, and his brain did something it hadn't done in 3 years. Finished the tune before Tamara could. He knew the next 3 notes, the little dip in pitch, the way the hum would rise again before trailing off into silence. He knew it the way you know your own heartbeat, automatic and unavoidable. And then he was somewhere else entirely. Not standing in the garden but lying in bed at 2 in the morning. Sheets tangled around his legs, Yuna's back pressed against his chest. She'd hum that exact melody when she couldn't sleep. Her voice so soft he'd feel it more than hear it, vibrating through her ribcage into his. Same rhythm. Same pauses where she'd take a breath. Same ending that never quite resolved. Like the song was asking a question she'd never gotten around to answering. The memory hit him with the force of a car crash. His throat closed. His hands went cold. For 3 years he'd convinced himself he was fine, that he'd processed this, that he'd moved on like a rational person who understood death was final. But standing there listening to a woman who shouldn't know this song, who couldn't possibly know this song, Hajun realized he'd been lying to himself so hard he'd started believing it. His voice came out sharp enough to cut. Stop! The word cracked down the middle like ice splitting under pressure. He hadn't meant for it to sound like that. Hadn't meant to let anything show. But the command tore out of him raw and desperate, and both guards actually flinched. Hajun never raised his voice. Hajun never lost control. And yet here he was, standing in his own garden, coming apart over a tune that shouldn't exist anymore. Tamara's hands went still. The watering can slipped from her grip and hit the dirt with a dull thud. Water spilled across the rose bed, dark and spreading. She turned slowly, eyes wide, and Hajun watched all the color drain from her face. She looked at him the way prey looks at a predator that's just noticed them moving. Frozen, calculating whether running would make it worse. "I'm sorry." Her voice came out small and shaking. "I didn't mean to. I don't even realize I'm doing it half the time. I don't know why I hum it. It just comes out." She took a step back, hands up like she could ward off whatever was about to happen. "I'm sorry. I'll stop. I promise I'll stop." But Hajun wasn't looking at her anymore. He was staring at the space where she'd been standing, at the roses she'd been watering, at the garden that suddenly felt like a graveyard. Because that melody wasn't random. It wasn't something you picked up from the radio or learned in passing. It was specific. It was hers. And if this woman knew it, if she'd been humming it without knowing what it meant, then Yuna had left something behind after all. Something Hajun hadn't managed to bury. You ever have a moment where your entire reality shifts and you realize nothing was ever what you thought? Hajun just had his. Hit that subscribe button because what he's about to uncover will rewrite everything you think you know about grief, secrets, and the people we trust. The study smelled like leather and old wood and something else Tamara couldn't name. Could it be fear, maybe her own? She sat in a chair that cost more than 6 months of her salary, hands twisted together in her lap, while Hajun paced in front of the window with his back to her. The silence stretched so long she started counting her heartbeats just to prove time was still moving. When he finally turned around, his face had gone blank again. That crack in his composure sealed over like it had never existed. But his eyes, God, his eyes looked like open wounds. "Where did you learn that song?" His voice came out flat and clinical, the tone of someone performing surgery without anesthesia. Tamara's mouth went dry. She'd been running through possible answers since the guards had escorted her inside. But none of them sounded true even to her own ears. "I don't know." She hated how weak that sounded. "I've just always known it, I think. It's been in my head for as long as I can remember." "That's not an answer." Hajun moved closer, and Tamara's instincts screamed at her to run. But there was nowhere to go. 2 guards stood by the door, still as statues, watching her like she might explode. "Who taught you? A woman? A man? Was it recent or years ago?" "I don't know." Her voice cracked. "I'm sorry. I know that sounds insane, but I don't remember. My childhood is full of holes. There are whole years I can't account for, people I should remember but don't. The song is just there, like my own name." Hajun's jaw worked like he was chewing on something bitter. "Have you been inside this house before? Before you were hired?" "No, I haven't, never have I. I swear." Tamara leaned forward, desperate for him to believe her. "I didn't even know this place existed until I saw the job posting. I've never been here, never met you, never met anyone connected to you." But he wasn't listening anymore. He was already turning to one of the guards, issuing orders in a voice so cold it made the air conditioning feel warm. "Full background check. I want every place she's lived, every person she's been in contact with, every gap in her employment history explained. Put a camera in her quarters. Monitor her phone. No contact with the other staff until I say otherwise." The words landed like stones in Tamara's stomach. She stood up without meaning to, chair scraping against hardwood. "Wait, what? You can't just... I can do whatever I want." Hajun's eyes met hers, and there was something in them that made her blood run cold. Not anger. Worse, desperation disguised as control. "You're not leaving this estate until I understand why you know something that died 3 years ago." That's when it hit her, the real truth of her situation. She wasn't an employee anymore. She was evidence. A puzzle piece he needed to force into place even if it meant breaking her to make her fit. The door wasn't locked, but it might as well have been. The gardens she'd found so beautiful that morning now looked like prison walls. Hajun hadn't raised his voice or threatened her directly, but Tamara understood violence came in more forms than fists. Sometimes it came dressed up as questions you couldn't answer. Sometimes it came in the shape of a man who'd buried his grief so deep, He'd do anything to understand why it was clawing its way back to the surface. She was trapped, not by chains or locked doors, but by a melody she couldn't explain and a dead woman's memory she'd somehow stolen without knowing it. Ever felt like you're being punished for something you didn't do but can't prove your innocence? That's where Tamara is right now. Comment below if you think she'll find a way out, because honestly, I'm not sure she will. Hajun spent 2 days tearing through his wife's past like a man possessed. He'd opened the locked room he'd sworn never to enter again. The one where Yuna's belongings sat in labeled boxes gathering dust and ghosts. Her journals, her sheet music, her phone records from years he'd tried to forget. He ran the melody through every database his people had access to. Music recognition software, international song libraries, copyright registries. Nothing. The tune didn't exist in any official capacity. It wasn't Korean, wasn't Western pop, wasn't anything that had ever been recorded or sold or played on a radio somewhere. It was a ghost song, something that lived only in the spaces between memory and grief. Then he found the notebook. Small, leather-bound, tucked inside a box of Yuna's teaching materials. She'd been composing something, pencil scratches across staff paper, notes that climbed and fell in a pattern he recognized instantly. His hands shook as he read the title she'd written at the top in her careful handwriting. For the girl who forgot how to sleep. Below it, a date. 7 years ago. Before they'd married. Before he'd built these walls around himself. When Yuna still volunteered at that shelter across town, the one for women and children escaping situations too dark to name in polite company. The phone records confirmed it. Dozens of calls to the shelter during that same period. Hajun made a call of his own, pulled strings he'd been saving for emergencies, and got access to the volunteer logs. There it was. Yuna's name next to a notation, primary support for minor, case file sealed. And next to that, a detail that made his chest go tight. Client. Black female, age 8 to 10, trauma response, selective memory loss. Meanwhile, Tamara was coming apart in her quarters. The headaches started the second night, sharp and vicious, like someone was using an ice pick behind her eyes. But worse than the pain were the fragments that came with it. Flashes of things she couldn't quite see. A woman's face hovering above her. Features blurred but the feeling crystal clear. Safety. Warm hands smoothing her hair back. A voice humming that melody while Tamara sobbed into a pillow that smelled like lavender detergent. Shoo, sweet girl, I've got you. You're safe now. Listen to my voice. Remember this sound. Even when you forget everything else. Remember this. Tamara woke up gasping, cheeks wet, not sure if she'd been crying in her sleep or in her memory. The song wasn't something she'd learned. It was something that had been planted in her, deliberately, by someone who knew Tamara's mind was going to erase the trauma and take everything else with it. A musical bookmark in a brain that was busy deleting chapters to survive. The woman in her fractured memory had given her an anchor disguised as a lullaby. Something that would stay even when faces and names and entire years dissolved into static. Hajun found the last piece of the puzzle in Yuna's email drafts. Never sent. Written a month before she died. I think about that little girl sometimes. I hope she's okay. I hope she remembers me, even if it's just the song. I hope it still makes her feel safe. He read it 3 times, each pass driving the truth deeper. Yuna hadn't just known Tamara. She'd saved her, poured herself into a broken child and left an imprint so deep it survived amnesia, foster care, and a decade of silence. The song was a gift, promise, a piece of Yuna that refused to die. Think about the people who shaped you when you were too young or too broken to understand what they were doing. Someone out there planted seeds in you that are still growing. Hit that like button if this story is reminding you that love doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just hums in the background until you're ready to hear it. The paper trail Yuna left behind wasn't accidental. Hajun realized that as he sat surrounded by documents his investigators had pulled from sealed files and redacted records that shouldn't have been accessible at all. She'd been careful, surgical even, but not invisible. It was like she'd wanted someone to find this eventually, just not too soon. Bank transfers to a legal aid organization. payments to a private relocation service, a falsified birth certificate with a new name, new birthday, new origin story. All of it traced back to one source. His wife, moving money and pulling strings during a 6-month period 7 years ago, when she told him she was just volunteering. Tamara hadn't just been a case file to Yuna. She'd been a project. A rescue mission Yuna had taken on with the kind of focus most people reserved for their own children. The shelter records painted the picture in brutal strokes. 8-year-old girl. Brought in by police after a domestic situation turned lethal. Mother dead. Father in custody. Child catatonic? Nonverbal. Displaying signs of severe psychological trauma. Standard protocol was temporary placement followed by entry into the foster system. But Yuna had seen something in that broken little girl that made her break every rule she'd ever followed. She'd falsified documents. Changed Tamara's name to protect her from a father whose criminal network had reached even from behind bars. Paid a small fortune to relocate her across state lines into a foster system where her real identity would stay buried. And through it all, through the paperwork and the lies and the risk of criminal charges if anyone found out, Yuna had sat with that child every single night for 3 months. Humming. Holding her while she screamed herself awake from nightmares. Pouring herself into Tamara like she could fill all those empty spaces with something good enough to survive the forgetting. The song was never just a lullaby. It was a time capsule. A piece of code Yuna had embedded into Tamara's shattered psyche. Knowing the trauma would erase faces and voices and everything else. But melodies lived deeper than memory. They lived in the body, in the nervous system, in places amnesia couldn't reach. Yuna had given Tamara something that would outlast the horror. Comfort. A promise that said, someone loved you enough to stay. And more than that, a memory implant designed to survive death itself. Because Yuna had to have known, even then, that people like her didn't live forever. That violence had a way of finding even the most careful among them. Hajun sat in his study as dawn broke, staring at a photo he'd found in the very last box. Yuna holding a small black girl with cornrows and haunted eyes. Both of them smiling, but the girl's smile didn't reach past her mouth. On the back, in Yuna's handwriting, Tamara, my brave girl. She'll forget me, but she'll carry me anyway. His throat burned. For 3 years he'd thought his wife had left him with nothing. No children, no legacy, just an empty house and a silence that ate him alive. But here was the truth, humming in his garden, watering his roses. Alive because Yuna had decided one broken child was worth risking everything. Tamara wasn't a threat. She was an echo, the last piece of his wife that still drew breath and laughed and existed in the world. Yuna had trusted her with something Hajun himself didn't get to keep. Proof that love could be louder than death. You ever realize that the thing you thought was breaking you was actually the only thing holding you together? Drop a comment if you've ever discovered someone's true impact long after they were gone. Because Hajun's about to understand that protecting Yuna's legacy means protecting the woman carrying it. Word travels fast in Hajun's world, especially when it smells like blood in the water. His enemies had spent 3 years watching him operate like a machine, cold and calculated, impossible to rattle. Then suddenly the Ice King was interrogating staff, pulling records, spending hours locked in a room he'd forbidden anyone to enter. Someone noticed. Someone always notices when a man who never blinks starts blinking. The Kwan family, rivals who'd been waiting for any opening, any crack in Hajun's armor, saw their chance. They didn't know the details, didn't need to. All they knew was Hajun had a weakness now, and weaknesses were meant to be exploited. The attack came on a Thursday morning while Tamara was cutting roses near the east wall. She'd been doing it for 20 minutes, scissors in hand, humming without thinking because the fear had started to fade, and that was her first mistake. The second mistake belonged to the guard rotation. Someone had been paid off. Someone had left a gap in the patrol schedule just wide enough for a professional to slip through. Tamara didn't hear him coming, didn't see the suppressed pistol or the cold calculation in his eyes. She just felt the hand clamp over her mouth and the blade press against her ribs hard enough to draw blood through her uniform. Make a sound and you're dead. The voice was flat, practiced. This wasn't his first time. Your boss values you. We're going to find out how much. But Ha-jun was already moving. He'd been watching the security feeds from his office, something he'd started doing obsessively since the interrogation, and he'd seen the figure approach from the blind spot his own paranoia had created. He didn't call for backup, didn't wait for protocol. He just ran. By the time he reached the garden, the man had Tamara on her knees, gun to her temple, phone out to record proof of life. Ha-jun came around the hedge line with his own weapon drawn, and the look on his face made even the assassin hesitate. Let her go. Ha-jun's voice was steady, but his hands weren't. This is between families. She's nobody. Then why are you holding a gun like she's somebody? The assassin pressed the barrel harder against Tamara's skull. She whimpered, eyes squeezed shut, and Ha-jun watched 3 years of emotional control evaporate in the space between heartbeats. The Kwan family would see this footage. They'd know. They'd smell the desperation on him and come for Tamara again and again until either she was dead or Ha-jun had been bled dry trying to protect her. The shot rang out before Ha-jun fully decided to take it. Muscle memory. Survival instinct. The assassin dropped, dead before he understood what happened. Tamara collapsed forward, hyperventilating. Blood on her shirt from the knife wound, but alive. Ha-jun stood there with his weapon still raised, staring at the body, and felt the full weight of his choice settle over him like cement. He could lock Tamara in a bunker underground where no one could reach her. Keep her safe the way you keep valuables in a vault, hidden and suffocated. Or he could do what Yuna would have done. Protect her in the light. Claim her publicly as someone under his shield. Start a war if that's what it took. The first option was safer. The second was right. And Ha-jun had spent 3 years choosing safe over right, choosing control over connection, choosing to bury love instead of defending it. You ever have to decide between protecting someone the easy way or the right way? Between hiding what you care about or standing in front of it no matter the cost? Subscribe if you want to see what Ha-jun chooses, because this decision will define whether he's still the Ice King or finally the man Yuna believed he could be. They came at midnight when the moon was just a sliver and the shadows had teeth. 8 men. Professional. Armed with the kind of weapons you don't buy at sporting goods stores. The Kwan family had decided that if Ha-jun wanted to protect the girl openly, they'd make him do it in front of everyone. Cameras mounted on their vests. Live stream queued up. The world was about to watch the Ice King bleed, and they were going to sell tickets to the aftermath. Gunfire erupted across the east wall. Explosions took out 2 guard posts. The estate's alarm system screamed into the night like a wounded animal, and Ha-jun's men mobilized with the efficiency of soldiers who'd trained for exactly this nightmare. Ha-jun dragged Tamara toward the safe room in the main house, her wrist in his grip, her feet barely keeping up. But when they reached the reinforced door, she planted herself and refused to move. No, her voice cut through the chaos. I'm not hiding anymore. I've been hiding my whole life. You'll die out here. Ha-jun's face was stone, but his eyes were screaming. Another explosion rocked the grounds. Glass shattered somewhere close. Get inside. Then I'll die standing. Tamara pulled her arm free, and something in her posture had changed. The woman who'd kept her eyes down and made herself small was gone. In her place stood someone who'd decided fear was more exhausting than bravery. Your wife didn't save me, so I could spend the rest of my life in boxes. The words hit Ha-jun like a fist to the chest. He didn't have time to argue because the first attacker rounded the corner, rifle raised, and Ha-jun put 2 rounds center mass before the man could blink. Then they were moving. Not to safety but toward the garden where the assault was concentrated. Tamara stayed close, unarmed but refusing to cower, and somewhere between the hedge line and the fountain she started singing. Not humming, singing. The melody Yuna had given her. Full voice. Clear and strong even as bullets chewed through rose bushes and men screamed orders in the dark. Ha-jun heard it. Even with his heart hammering and his training taking over and his weapon kicking against his palm, he heard her. And something clicked into place that had been broken for 3 years. The song didn't weaken him. It didn't drag him back into grief or make him vulnerable. It anchored him, reminded him what he was fighting for. not territory or reputation or the cold mechanics of power. He was fighting for the last living piece of someone who'd believed people were worth saving even when it cost everything. He moved through the garden like a force of nature. Brutal, precise, no hesitation. His men rallied around him, feeding off the certainty in his movements. The attackers had expected the Ice King, calculated and distant. What they got was something worse. A man with nothing left to lose and everything left to protect. Hajun cornered the last one near the koi pond, the squad leader with the camera still rolling on his vest. The man raised his hands, started to bargain. But Hajun was done negotiating. One shot. Clean. Final. The body hit the water and the camera feed went dark. Silence crashed over the estate like a wave. Smoke drifted through the garden. Blood soaked into the soil where the roses grew. Tamara stood in the middle of it all, still singing the last notes of Yuna's lullaby, her voice shaking but unbroken. Hajun walked to her through the wreckage, holstered his weapon, and just looked at her. This woman who'd survived everything the world threw at her and still had the courage to sing in the dark. The garden had survived, stained but standing, just like both of them. The sun came up on a garden that looked like a war zone. Medics treated the wounded guards. Cleanup crews photographed evidence. Police asked questions Hajun's lawyers would answer later with carefully crafted half-truths. Through it all, Tamara sat on the stone bench near the fountain, still wearing her blood-stained uniform, staring at the roses that had somehow survived the gunfire. Hajun found her there an hour after the last ambulance left. He looked exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the fighting, like he'd been awake for 3 years and finally felt it. He sat down beside her without asking permission, leaving a respectful distance between them. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Hajun broke the silence with an offer he'd been rehearsing in his head. I can set you up anywhere you want. New identity. New country if that's what you need. Enough money that you'll never have to work again. Complete protection. The Kwan family won't touch you. No one will. You'll disappear so thoroughly even I won't be able to find you. Tamara turned to look at him, and there was something in her expression that made him realize she'd been expecting this. No. The word came out soft but immovable. I'm done disappearing. Your wife spent a fortune making me invisible, and I'm grateful for that because it kept me alive. But I was 8 years old then. I'm not 8 anymore. Hajun's jaw tightened. You saw what just happened. They'll come for you again. This won't be the last time. I know. Tamara stood up, facing him fully now. And I'm still saying no. I want the truth. All of it. Everything your wife did for me. Every document she forged. Every lie she told to keep me safe. I want to know who I was before someone decided I needed to forget. I want my real name back, not the one on some social worker's paperwork. And I want my freedom, not the kind where I'm locked in a gilded cage or shipped off to hide on some island. The kind where I get to decide what happens next. She watched him process that, watched the control freak in him want to argue, to convince her that safety mattered more than agency. But something stopped him. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the memory of Yuna's voice telling him that love meant letting go. Maybe it was the simple fact that Tamara had sung in a firefight and earned the right to make her own terrible choices. Okay. The word cost him. You could see it in the way his shoulders dropped. I'll tell you everything. We'll find your records, your real birth certificate, whatever's left of your history. And you can stay or go. Your choice. No strings. Just like that. Tamara sounded suspicious, and she had every right to be. Just like that. Hajun met her eyes, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw something other than ice. My wife spent her last years fighting to give you a future. I won't disrespect that by taking your choices away. It wasn't a declaration of love or a dramatic reconciliation. It was something quieter and more profound. Two people who'd survived different kinds of death, choosing to honor the woman who'd connected them by actually listening to what the other needed. Hajun had built an empire on control. But sitting in that ruined garden with a woman who refused to be saved on anyone's terms but her own, He finally understood what Yuna had been trying to teach him all along. Power wasn't about making people do what you wanted. It was about having the strength to let them choose, even when their choice scared you. Tamara extended her hand. Hajun looked at it for a moment, then shook it. Not as employer and employee. Not as captor and captive. As equals who'd bled in the same dirt and come out the other side changed. The garden looked almost the way it had before. Almost. The bullet holes in the stone fountain had been patched, but you could still see the seams if you knew where to look. 3 rose bushes had died and been replaced with younger plants that didn't quite match the others yet. The koi pond had new fish because the old ones hadn't survived the body that fell into their water. But the hedges were trimmed. The grass was green. The morning sun still filtered through the trees in that particular way that made everything look softer than it was. Tamara knelt by the east wall, trowel in hand, planting new bulbs that wouldn't bloom until spring. She'd stayed, not because Hajun asked her to, but because she'd decided the garden was worth fighting for. She wore jeans and a simple shirt now, not the uniform. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and as she worked, pressing soil around delicate roots, she hummed. The melody rose from her throat without hesitation, without fear, without the unconscious quality it had carried before. This time she knew exactly what she was singing. She knew who'd given it to her and why. She knew what it cost and what it meant. And she sang it anyway, by choice. Hajun stood at the study window, coffee cup in hand, watching her through the glass. He'd been doing this most mornings for the past 3 weeks. Not supervising, not monitoring, just watching. The way you watch something precious that doesn't belong to you but exists in your world anyway. He heard the melody even through the closed window. Every note, every pause, every place where Yuna's breath would have caught before continuing. It didn't hurt the way it used to. The grief was still there, would probably always be there, but it had changed shape. Become something he could carry instead of something that carried him. No guards rushed into the garden. No one ordered Tamara to stop. The estate had learned a new rule without Hajun ever speaking it aloud. Some sounds were allowed now. Some memories could exist in the daylight. Some pieces of the past were meant to be honored instead of buried. Hajun took a sip of his coffee and allowed himself something he hadn't permitted in 3 years. A smile. Small. Sad. But real. Tamara finished planting the last bulb and sat back on her heels, wiping dirt from her hands. She looked up at the window where Hajun stood, and even from that distance, their eyes met. She nodded once. He nodded back, an acknowledgement that they'd both survived something that should have destroyed them, that Yuna's final gift hadn't been the song itself, but the courage embedded inside it, the bravery to keep singing even when the world told you to be silent. The strength to choose connection over safety. The wisdom to understand that some things are worth the risk of breaking. Tamara stood, brushed the dirt from her knees, and walked toward the house still humming. Hajun turned from the window and went to meet her, because some songs don't belong to the dead. They belong to the brave. And both of them, finally, had learned how to be brave enough to let love survive in whatever form it took. Even if that form was just a melody floating through a garden that had seen too much blood and somehow still grew roses. If this story reminded you that grief doesn't have to be the end of love, that courage sometimes sounds like a lullaby, and that the people we lose leave echoes in the people we meet, then share it. Because somewhere out there, someone needs to know that it's okay to keep singing. Drop a comment telling me which moment hit you hardest. And if you want more stories that'll make you feel everything, hit that subscribe button. Some stories stay with you long after they end. This is one of them.